90%.
Yes.
That's the homeownership rate in Singapore. Can you believe that?
It's really remarkable.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a sec, Compared to what, 65-ish% in the US, 72% in the EU,
Yeah.
63 in Australia. I mean, it really makes you wonder, how did they do that? How on earth did they pull that off?
Yeah, it's a striking difference for sure, and that's exactly what makes this Singapore model, as it's often called, of home ownership, so fascinating, so intriguing, and today we're going to do a deep dive into a whole collection of sources, everything from policy analyses to, historical overviews, to unpack this thing, to unpack the core strategies behind this success story. So think of this as your shortcut to understanding this whole system, a system that's led to some really, really high rates of home ownership.
Exactly. And for you listening, we know that navigating the world of housing policy can be, honestly, a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
There's so much jargon. So our mission today is to, try to extract the most crucial and the most interesting insights from all of this material, tailored specifically to give you a really solid understanding without getting bogged down in all the minutiae and details.
Right.
Right. We want to understand those key components, the institutions that are involved, and ultimately, what can we learn? What can we take away from Singapore's unique approach? So, okay, let's jump right into it. That 90% figure, it wasn't always that way, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, think about it. Back when Singapore gained independence in 1965, their home ownership rate was, get this, just 27%.
Oh.
Tiny. Fast forward less than 3 decades, and bam, they hit that astonishing 90%.
That is just incredible.
Yeah, it really speaks volumes about the policies they put in place.
Less than 30 years to go from 27 to 90%. I mean, the speed of that transformation is it's mind-boggling. And it really suggests they had a very deliberate and effective plan in place right from the start. So what were some of those key policies? What were the big decisions that enabled such a rapid change?
Well, the central driver of this whole thing, this whole transformation, was the Housing and Development Board, or HDB.
Okay.
And this is a government body that was established with a very, very clear goal. I mean, it was ambitious, but it was clear. Solve the housing crisis and get people into homes they own. And it's incredible. The HDB has built something like 3/4 of all the housing in Singapore since it was established. And their role wasn't just construction, like putting up buildings. They were really proactive. They developed these affordable housing options, and they fostered these integrated communities. They were thinking about the whole picture.
So 3/4 of the nation's housing built by one entity. That's a level of government involvement we just don't see in many places, especially in the West, right?
Yeah, very different.
Now, building all those homes, that's a huge feat in itself.
Yeah.
But how did they make sure that people could afford to actually buy them?
Right.
That's got to be the real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the financial innovation comes in.
Okay.
There were 2 key institutions that were really instrumental in all of this. First, you have the Development Bank of Singapore, or DBS, established in 1968.
Okay.
Its initial, mandate was to finance Singapore's, industrialization, urban development, the whole thing.
Right.
And that crucially included housing. So DBS was providing loans to HDB buyers, and this was across all income levels. So they were making financing really accessible to pretty much everyone.
So they were kind of like banks and a lot of other countries providing mortgages. But was there anything unique about their approach?
Yeah, I mean, they function like a bank, sure,
Right.
but the scale of it and that explicit public mandate, to support this national mission of the HDB, that was really distinct. And then you have the second piece, which is arguably even more pivotal, the Central Provident Fund, or CPF.
Okay, CPF.
You can think of it as their national social security system.
Okay.
But here's the fascinating thing, the thing that makes it so unique. Citizens can actually withdraw funds from their CPF, not just for a down payment on a home, but also to make their monthly mortgage payments.
Wait, hold on. You can use your Social Security to buy a house and pay your mortgage.
Exact.
That's That's incredible. I mean, it completely changes the game in terms of affordability.
Yeah, and it aligns their national savings with this national goal of homeownership. It's a level of integration you just don't see in a lot of other places.
Right.
And so what you get is this really powerful closed loop system. The national savings are directly funneled into homeownership. And this significantly eases the financial burden, that upfront cost for buyers.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So they tackled the financing challenge in a really innovative way. But Singapore is a tiny island, right? I mean, land must have been a major, major constraint when they were building all those homes.
Oh, absolutely. Land scarcity was a huge hurdle. I mean, they've only got 290 square miles to work with.
Yeah.
So the government adopted some pretty radical strategies to overcome that.
Okay.
One big move was just they completely eradicated agriculture. It was like,
Yeah.
nope, no more farms. We need this land for housing and development.
Ah.
And then they also made this very decisive shift away from single-family homes. They're like, we're going to focus almost exclusively on high-rise buildings to maximize the land they had. So no sprawling suburbs like you see in other parts of the world.
So almost entirely high-rise living. What about the ownership structure of the land? Like, do people own the land these buildings are on?
Well, for most of these HDB developments, they operate on a 99-year leasehold system.
99 years.
Yeah. So unlike a freehold, where you own the land, forever,
Right, right.
a leasehold gives you the right to occupy the property for that fixed term. And this generally makes the initial purchase price way more affordable than owning the land outright.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then after that 99 years, the ownership reverts back to the state.
Okay. So we've got strategic land use, we've got this integrated financing model, both crucial. But how did they ensure that these homes remained affordable, not just when they were first built, but over time?
Well, affordability it really is at the core of this whole Singapore model.
Okay.
The government provides substantial subsidies, especially for those first-time buyers, to make sure those HDB flats are accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And these public housing estates, they're not just blocks of flats. They're meticulously planned. They've got essential services, green spaces, efficient public transport. This integrated approach, it really helps lower the overall cost of living for the residents.
And did they do anything to prevent, like, speculation? Those rapid price increases we see in a lot of housing markets.
Oh, yeah. Singapore has a whole range of regulations aimed at curbing that kind of speculation and keeping things affordable.
Okay.
So, for example, there are restrictions on reselling public housing within a certain time frame. So you can't just flip it for a quick profit. They also have these things called cooling measures, which they've used at various times to kind of moderate those price surges in the resale market. And the government offers some pretty substantial housing grants.
Really?
Yeah. Like first-timer families, they can get up to $120,000 in grants for a new flat and potentially even more, something like $230,000 for a resale flat.
That is significant.
Yeah, depending on their circumstances. But I mean, those are big numbers.
Yeah.
Designed to make homeownership a reality for people.
It sounds like they're really going all in on helping people get on that property ladder.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are also these different priority schemes designed to support certain groups. So, you have young married couples buying their first home, families with kids, elderly parents who want to live near their adult children.
I see.
So it's targeted. It makes sure those housing policies align with broader social and demographic goals.
So this is clearly a very proactive, government-led approach.
Yeah.
How does this differ from, like, the more market-driven systems we tend to see in the West? For our listeners in the U.S., Europe, Australia, that more market-driven approach, that's probably what they're used to.
Yeah, and the contrast is pretty stark. I mean, in the West, housing development is largely driven by private developers, market forces.
Right.
The government, their role tends to be more limited. They might provide some subsidies for lower income households or set up some regulatory frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
But in Singapore, the government, through the HDB, they're the primary developer, the planner, the manager. They're actively shaping the market to make sure there's a good supply of affordable homes. And they're really prioritizing home ownership over renting. To a much greater degree than you see in most Western countries.
You also mentioned how housing is integrated with broader social policies in Singapore. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, sure. One notable example is they have these ethnic quotas within public housing estates.
Hmm.
And this policy, it promotes racial integration, social harmony by making sure there's a good mix of different ethnic groups in each community.
I see.
And then the way these estates are planned, they're like these self-contained communities.
Right.
They have schools, markets, healthcare facilities, all readily accessible. So it's not just about providing shelter, it's viewed as a fundamental part of social and economic stability.
So it sounds like this system has been particularly beneficial for lower-income households. What are some of the specific advantages they experience?
Yeah, so lower income families, they definitely benefit a lot. They have access to that subsidized pricing on new HDB flats.
Right.
And the various grants we talked about, that's crucial financial assistance for them.
Mm-hmm.
They often benefit from lower utility costs in those public housing estates as well.
Okay.
But critically, this system really facilitates homeownership. It allows these households to build equity over time through their CPF contributions and those affordable mortgages from the HDB. And then because of that mixed income nature of these estates, lower income residents, they have access to the same amenities, the same public services as everyone else.
Right.
So it prevents that kind of concentrated poverty that you sometimes see in other places.
So it's a deliberate effort to foster social mixing, prevent the creation of those segregated, disadvantaged neighborhoods. But I remember you mentioned earlier that the impact on overall income inequality is complex.
Yeah.
Right? There are some downsides, some negative aspects to consider. Can you talk a bit about those?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the widespread homeownership, that's obviously a huge positive.
Of course.
And it has contributed to some significant intergenerational mobility, particularly in housing. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds, they have a better chance of having a better housing situation than their parents.
Right.
But there are these growing concerns about wealth disparity as well. And we're starting to see this kind of two-tiered system emerging.
Okay.
So some of these HDB flats in really desirable locations, they're now fetching million-dollar prices on the resale market.
$1 million public housing units. That does seem a bit contradictory to the whole idea of affordability.
Yeah, and it reflects that increasing market value of those properties, because of location, size, amenities. And this trend was kind of amplified by some past policies. Back in the 1990s, there was this thing called the asset enhancement policy, which some argue shifted the perception of public housing towards being more of a wealth-building asset. So as a result, you've got this widening gap in the value of those different HDB flats. And the price-to-income ratio for HDB flats, that's also been rising, which indicates a decline in affordability for some segments of the population.
I see.
And you can't forget the broader influence of foreign investment in the overall Singaporean property market,
Right.
which can indirectly impact HDB prices as well.
So even with all this government intervention, market forces, they still find a way to exert their influence and potentially lead to those inequalities.
Yeah, it's a complex system.
Are there any other challenges, any other limitations that we should be aware of with this Singapore model?
Yeah, there are a few other things to think about. So Singapore's population is aging, and that could potentially lead to market saturation in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ongoing discussions in Singapore about the extent of state power in housing allocation,
Right.
and how much that limits individual choice. And then, we talked about migrant populations. They're a significant part of the workforce, but they largely don't have access to public housing. And that raises some important social questions.
Right, of course. So it's not a perfect system by any means, but achieving 90% home ownership, that's still incredibly impressive.
Oh, yeah.
So for someone listening to this, someone who's maybe dealing with those affordability challenges in their own country, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from the Singapore model?
I think there are several really valuable lessons here. First of all, it shows the potential of a strong, proactive government role.
Mm-hmm.
When there's clear political will to tackle those housing needs head on, that can be really transformative. Second, that integrated urban planning, combining housing with infrastructure, services, green spaces, that's clearly really important.
Right.
And then the way they use those national savings mechanisms like the CPF to finance housing, that's a unique approach that other countries could definitely consider. And of course, that focus on affordability, that consistent, unwavering focus, that's crucial. And finally, they're making such efficient use of limited land, building upwards.
Right.
That provides valuable insights for other densely populated areas around the world.
Absolutely. Okay, let's do a quick recap of the core of the Singapore model for our listeners. So it's a mix of, strong government involvement, strict regulations, this innovative system of using national savings for housing, very strategic land management, and a real commitment to keeping housing affordable for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great summary. You hit all the key pillars.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener. Given all these insights we've explored about Singapore's, unique approach to homeownership, what do you think? What single most significant shift in thinking or in policy do you believe would have the most impact in addressing the housing challenges in your own country, in your own community? It's a big question, but it's worth pondering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to keep thinking about those principles, those strategies we talked about, and how they might spark new conversations, new solutions in your local context.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Singapore model. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little inspiring.